Okay, so I've actually done this recording one time already, and I had the mute button on, so I'm going to go back and try and get everything I did the first time uploaded again, because for some reason I had the mute button on, and I didn't notice it. So I'm going to try this all over again, and hopefully it'll be as good as the first time I did it. But usually if you repeat something, you do it better the second time. So we're going to try this and see how it goes. So this conceptual framework deals with two main ideas that I wanted to kind of build up of. First of all, do students have internet access at home? I wanted to look and see, okay, first of all, do students have internet access at home? It's a pretty simple question to ask. You could take a survey, you could ask a questionnaire of students in the classroom and see, do they have student internet access at home? By the way, I used Sesame Street here because my kids were watching it when I was working on this conceptual framework, and I figured there would be a lot of pictures online and a lot of ways for me to tie this in, so I figured Sesame Street was, a representation of home, and internet access was the lightning bolts. It seemed like a good image. So anyway, moving on. So that was my first big question was, do they have internet access at home? And I really wanted to tie this into student performance in the classroom, this big idea of teacher perceptions of student performance. I was trying to stay away from the quantitative mindset of looking at only variables that were quantitative in terms of ACT scores and scores in the classroom on standardized tests and different things like that. I really wanted to look at qualitative data in terms of how are the teachers perceiving students performing in their classroom, and can this be related to student internet access at home? So I had to start develop these ideas of, okay, what are the connections that I can make that will bring about this idea and make this measurable, and what are the connections to student internet access at home that may cause them to struggle in their performance in the classroom or promote their performance in the classroom. And as I was developing this concept, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, came this idea of, okay, yeah, maybe students have internet access at home, but the big thing is, do teachers actually use the internet for instruction? Do they use it to build upon the concepts in the classroom that they've discussed? Are there, resources that they put online? Do they have a website? Do they have a blog? Do they have anything like that? So kind of two ideas came about as this one concept of student internet access at home. And the other concept was, well, that might be true. They might have internet access at home, but does it really matter if teachers aren't using it, if they're not using it for instruction? So let me go back and talk about first the connections between student internet access at home. First thing I want to think about is, okay, what would a student use the internet for that might affect their performance in the classroom, that might connect to that? Excuse me. So my first idea was, okay, do they use social media? Excuse me. Do they use social media? Is social media a thing that they are used to using? Do they use Facebook? Do they use Twitter? Do they use Tumblr? Do they use these different types of social media? And do they have access to it? Do their parents allow them to use it? Do they not use it at all? Anything like that. So that was my first connection. The other connection I was thinking about was, okay, how do they interact with their peers? If they don't use social media, do students interact with their peers other ways, via email, anything like that? Do they text via the web? Do they use anything other than social media to connect with their peers? And do they connect with their peers outside of class? Are they interested in talking with? Do they think they are interested in talking to their classmates on a daily basis? And that connected this idea of group work in general. If students interact with their peers, maybe an observation of students interacting with their peers, how does that affect their group work? When teachers assign group work activities, are students actually doing that? Are they involved in their groups? That was a connection there. So building on this connection of student interaction with peers, came this idea of, okay, do students perceive they have a high social status? So if they're not interacting with their peers, is that because they feel like they're unpopular, or is it because they feel like they don't fit in, or they're not in with the same type of culture that they have that their other classmates are in? And then how does this affect, again, their group work based upon their perception of social status? And then another connection I was thinking about with student interaction with peers is the teacher perception of student performance. If students don't interact with their peers, does it cause them to struggle in their group work, or is it directly related to teacher perception of student performance if we take out that connection? So then I was thinking about this idea of student perception of social status, and then what do they perceive of their own performance in the classroom? If they think they're unpopular, does it somehow affect the way they perceive how they perceive they're doing in class? So that was that idea, and that connection there was, okay, if a student struggles socially, does that affect their performance in a classroom? Because they don't want to talk to people, so therefore they feel like they aren't doing well in the classroom. So then that, of course, led to this idea of, sorry, I believe there's something that's, oh, here we go, student motivation. Are students not motivated because they feel like they aren't performing well? Is that somehow affected to their motivation? Student motivation, I felt, could also be connected to their access to social media. If a student can't get online and talk to their friends on Twitter, or talk to their friends on Facebook, or talk to their teachers or anything on social media, does that somehow cause them to feel like they're unmotivated to want to be involved in a classroom, or the teachers, especially the teacher perception of student performance? Then, along these same lines, and another connection that I wanted to talk about here, and I don't want to jump around too much because I know there's a lot going on here. When talking about student perception of performance, this I felt was a connection to that other big idea of teacher use of web-based teaching practices. If a teacher is using the internet, does that cause a student to perceive they're doing better since they know what their grades are, or they know how they're doing, if they get good teacher feedback, if they receive adequate teacher feedback that lets them know how they're doing, does that somehow affect their performance? And does that affect how teachers perceive they are doing in a classroom? And then I thought, okay, if teachers are using web-based tools, does that directly correlate to teachers' perception of performance of students in their classroom? If a teacher is using the web to put those resources online and interact with students, does it somehow affect the teacher's perception of student performance in any way, and how students are doing in the classroom, because they can communicate with them outside of the classroom? And then I was thinking about this idea of, okay, if teachers are using web-based practices, what about social media? Are teachers using social media? And this was kind of a separate idea that kind of stemmed from that. I didn't necessarily think there was a connection between web-based teaching practices, but just kind of a separate idea of, do teachers use social media? And if they do, how does that affect student perceptions of teachers? I've read some articles before that talked about teachers using different types of social media to interact with their students, and then students explain that they had a different view of their teacher as a result of being able to see what the teacher does outside of the classroom and communicate with them that way. And I also wanted to think about, okay, how does this affect teacher-student interactions and student-teacher interactions, and the connections between these? First of all, if the teacher's using social media, how does that affect the way they interact specifically with students? Do the students feel like they interact, or the teachers interact with them more since they're on social media? And then also, how does that affect the way the students perceive they are interacting with teachers? So kind of a vice versa situation here, in that looking at students to teachers and then teachers to students and the connections between the two. Because if a student feels like they can't communicate with their teacher outside of school, are they less likely to interact with them in school? And then if a teacher doesn't communicate with students outside of school via social media, or if they don't use web-based practices, which is another connection here, do they have less interaction with the student that's inside the classroom? Or what other, even I think could fall into the same category, is the teacher-student interactions online. If they do use social media, or if they do use web-based teaching practices, how does that affect the teacher-to-student interactions? Do they feel like they're getting more interactions with their students by using those web-based practices? And another connection here was that connection of student motivation. Are students more motivated when their teachers use social media? Are they more motivated when the teachers use web-based practices? And then how, again, does this affect teacher perceptions of student performance, and how the teacher thinks the student is performing in the classroom? I wanted to touch on this other connection here, the student perception of content knowledge. So if a teacher uses web-based practices, so let me go back here and kind of build upon this connection. So the connection is here. How does that affect a student's perception of content knowledge? So specifically, okay, I know this information, and I wanted to separate these two ideas here because they kind of, one stem from the other, in that I knew there was this idea of student perception of how they're, of whether I'm performing in the classroom, whether I'm involved, whether I'm, doing what the teacher's asking, and then their perception of, okay, how much of this information in terms of the specific class that you're taking, do you feel you know the content? I mean, there's one thing of your performance in the classroom, I feel like I perform well, I do these certain things, but then there's another idea of, do I actually know anything about the concept that we're supposed to be learning in class, or concepts, the content area? I deal with an area of chemistry specifically in terms of what I teach, and so I'm always interested in, okay, do the students feel like they actually know the information? And a student may feel like they do the work in the class, but then the other question is, okay, do you actually know the content? And then if a student feels like, okay, I don't know the content, how does that directly affect or how does that correlate or connect to the teacher's perception of the student performing in the classroom? So, once again, I want to make sure and kind of build upon this idea of I'm really interested in student internet access at home in terms of public policy and driving home this idea of, okay, do students really need to have internet access at home? Does every child need some way of getting online, because it truly affects how they perform in the classroom based upon, this qualitative study. And I wanted to look at, okay, do teachers really need to use web-based teaching practices? Do they really need to go home and get online and fill out a blog and put student grades online and do all these things, because it truly affects how students perform in the classroom based upon the teacher perception? And then if teachers are using social media, does it really affect student perceptions of the teacher? Is a teacher viewed differently if they use teaching practices online and if they use social media? There's several different ideas that I'm coming up with, in terms of these connections, in terms of, what does the research literature say about how to measure student performance? I mean, in terms of qualitative studies that have done this, have they used a questionnaire? Have they used a survey? How have they actually measured student performance without, just looking at the numerical data? Did they ask the teachers how they're doing? Did they go in and just observe the classroom? And I'm interested really to look at that. And then I know this idea of student motivation is huge in terms of qualitative data and how we measure student motivation. And I want to look at that specifically in the research literature and see what are possible connections that I don't see here with student motivation, and how could I possibly even make more connections with this concept of student motivation. I know student perceptions of what they know in terms of content knowledge. There's probably a ton of information out there about that. But I am truly interested in is it important that everyone's connected? I personally, my own bias here, and I know we've been talking a lot in previous classes about our own bias that we bring into research and our own, emotions that we bring in. And I know specifically here, I feel like every student needs to have access at home, because not only do we need to be using the internet, teachers need to be using the internet for instruction and building the content knowledge outside of the classroom, but I mean, students need to be connected with one another, and that's just my own personal perception, but I really want to do a research study that shows, okay, this is truly affecting how they how they perform in a classroom, how a student performs. And especially from an administrative point of view and from a leadership aspect, do we need to tell teachers, hey, you've got to get a website up, you got to get some way to connect your students, because it truly affects, your teaching strategy and how students would perform eventually, not only in your class but later on in life, in terms of, the fact that they're going to do better on the ACT because they're performing better in your classroom simply because they have internet access at home, or you as a teacher, using the internet to instruct them. So this was kind of my idea. I hope I explained it enough. If you have any questions or any comments, I'd really appreciate it, because I know the connections here, I hope I explained them enough, but I still know that there's a lot of things that may be confusing, because I know when I was building it, I was just like, man, this connects to that, and there's a lot of information here that might not even be there that I really think should be, in terms of, what is the research literature showing? How are these things measurable qualitatively? So I really appreciate any information you have, any feedback, any comments, so I can try to make this better. I know I really, now that I have this, want to go and look into the research literature and see, okay, how do people measure student performance in the classroom, and how do we measure all these different ideas of interaction with peers, interaction with teachers, teacher interaction with students, and student motivation. So I really appreciate any feedback you have, and I hope this does an adequate job of explaining this kind of this conceptual framework here. And I look forward to building on this idea and pushing it forward into hopefully a research concept and some good research questions. So thank you so much.